You're watching Beyond Markets. I'm Onyi. Sunday on the show today, our focus is on the risks that could impact business in both Africa and the world in 2018. You can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets. Follow my handle at Onyi Sunday. Now, President Trump's America First nationalism has opened the door to Chinese global leadership and in Africa, terrorism, militancy, political instability and fears of a potential debt crisis are themes that stakeholders will be paying attention to. Well, Nick Allen, CEO, Europe and Africa Region Control Risks, joins me for a discussion on the top risks for Africa and the world in 2018. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Nick.
Pleasure.
I think, of course, we should start off with the global outlook to begin with. What are the major global risks in 2018?
So we've identified five that we're talking about that are relevant to business. There are some, I think, high-profile risks around North Korea and the potential for conflict. Seems to be easing a bit. There's probably some good news about how North Korea is approaching the Winter Olympics. It's funny how these things actually matter. The challenges in the Middle East, I think, are a real powder keg. The not direct conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but the proxy conflict, what's going on in Yemen and Syria, the Iran supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon, all of that is going to keep going in 2018 and get worse. Then we look at different kinds of risks. One is cyber attacks. As you know well, in sitting here in Nigeria with a sophisticated banking sector, cyber information security concerns top of the agenda, and that's really a global theme. We think 2018, much more targeted attacks. And then, and I'm going to come to the last one you started with, which is Donald Trump. The fourth risk we're talking about is personalized leadership, and the President of the United States is he himself not the fifth risk, but some of his policies around protectionism. Is he really going to push those through? A lot going on just this week in the United States with talks of, a grand jury being formed to talk to Steve Bannon, threat of US shutdown, Donald Trump taking what appears to be siding with quite the hardline side of his party around immigration. So concerns around protectionism from the United States and what that could do to the global economy. Those are the five risks we're looking at. Not very cheerful, I'm afraid, but...
As I can look at these five risks, which do you think is of major concern? I mean, they're all bad, really, to begin with, but which do you think is of major concern? So,
at the really damaging end would be conflict on the Korean Peninsula. We think that's unlikely, but it's up there as a risk, because it's very easy to see the path to escalation. It's quite hard, if that starts, to see how North Korea versus South Korea, backed by the United States, backs down from that. I think, if you put that to one side, because that's a sort of war risk, the US getting much more protectionist, I think, is a real risk to the global economy. It's a real risk if we start thinking about Africa, because of the effects it might have. Africa depends a lot on not just commodity prices, but global trade. So I think I'd probably focus on that one, because Donald Trump has been quite clear about what he said in his run-up to his election, and he does seem to be pushing quite a lot of those policies. And a lot of people thought, when he became president, he would move to the centre. In a lot of areas, he hasn't.
So I kind of seem to not seeing that going away anytime soon. To be, taking a proper look at that particular story there. Now, how do you think other countries should begin to shape up for what's to come? I mean, clearly it's not going anywhere. He's maintained his stand from the very beginning, and we're not going to see this come to an end.
So I think you mentioned in your introduction there, you mentioned how other players on the world stage, such as China, engaging particularly across this continent in a meaningful way. Japan, also the European Union, growth returning there. The European Union has its own particular problems. So I think that diversification that countries are pursuing, not just in terms of their industries and what they depend on, but I think looking to new partners, slightly in the position, despite global growth returning, which is a good story, prepare for the worst. So I mentioned the European Union. I'm based in the UK. Prepare for the worst, because it's unclear how a lot of these issues are really going to be resolved.
How do you see African countries preparing for the worst as well? I mean, America is a major partner in most of these
Sure.
African countries. How do you see them, or how would you suggest that they begin to adjust to what's ahead?
So a lot of African countries have embraced investment from different parts of the world, particularly China has been a big player on this continent. A lot of the policies that African countries are pursuing or talk about pursuing, because not all of them pursue them successfully, are around diversifying their economy. Those are things they have to keep doing. Governance remains a key challenge for African countries, and there's competition, isn't there? Because when international firms are looking to invest, they tend to look at places where it's easier to do business. So you hear the government of Nigeria talking about, we want to be an easier place to do business. Those are things that make perfect sense. It's, as ever, it's easier to talk about them than implement them. But I think those are the things that countries are looking to do.
So, Claire, it's about time you actually look inwards and actually tidy up your table and see how you can actually move the economy forward. Because basically, most of these countries really do rely on the US for aid and some kind of support or the other.
Yes, I think that's true. And you also mentioned, talk about debt. Debt markets have been a good place to borrow recently because interest rates have been very low. Challenge is a lot of African countries have borrowed quite heavily. You see this early this year, Kenya is going to have to make a $750 million repayment on Eurobonds. That debt bubble is probably an overstatement, but the debt is building up. If we think about Nigeria, this government, a lot of talk about infrastructure spending. That has to be the right thing to do as long as it's done efficiently and countries can start getting the economic benefits on the back of it. So that is a looming issue, I think, for African countries.
Yeah, I guess for most Africans as well is the fact, I mean, there are those who say borrowing isn't the problem, where the money is going to is the major question. Let's take a look, of course, now at risks here within the African continent. With the focus, yes, on West Africa. Now, control risks, you have actually pointed about 5 risks to begin with within that region. We have terrorism and militancy. We have irregular regulations. I really want to hear more about that. Political instability, especially in Francophone West Africa. New sectors, new risks. That's also a key one we're going to be talking about as well. And ongoing operational risks. Just the 5 control risks has really put forward. Let's touch on, of course, the first one there, terrorism and militancy. I mean, just today we did talk about the fact that the Niger Delta militants have actually issued a fresh threat.
Fresh warning, yeah.
Yeah, to the federal government on the grounds of what they're talking about restructuring this time, following the killings in Benue to begin with. I mean, that's like a kind of like a fresh angle, if you ask me. But, let me hear more about this. Why do you think this is going to be key in 2018?
I think, so if we start at West Africa, that the region of the sort of the northern part of West Africa, the Sahel, remains in large parts a pretty much ungoverned space. And that is where militants can thrive. And there are smuggling routes going through there and they're all linked. And you're seeing quite a lot of military activity and French and other Western forces supporting governments there. For businesses, it's not quite a no-go area, but there's a lot of security costs if you want to, an oil and gas are up there if they want to do that. You were talking about Nigeria, so I think we're in. I know the election is 2019, but we're pretty much in the run-up now, as you all know better than I do, and those issues around militancy or conflict that Nigeria has, whether it's in northern Nigeria, and the government has made some headway in, I think, dealing with the security threat, but probably not the underlying causes. Then in the middle of the country, a lot in the media at the moment, and understandably so, about Fulani herdsmen and the attacks there. And then the Delta, which has been pretty quiet. So I'll read on the Delta, because that is still the beating heart of Nigeria's economy, certainly in terms of foreign exchange earnings, the commercial capital obviously here in Lagos. But in the Delta, it probably makes sense if you're a militant group to start issuing threats now in the run-up to an election, because there's threats so far have brought concessions, the payments that have been made to militants, former militants, and the government, despite if you recall, in the previous election campaign, there was quite a lot of talk from the current president, that these payments would be stopped. It's pretty hard to see in the short to medium term how this conflict gets resolved, because there are the 16 demands. Some of them are easier than others. Things like a maritime university, you can make progress on that. Some of the others are quite difficult. The idea that the southern states should have control of revenues, we don't see that happening. So these problems are pretty intractable. I think, interestingly for Nigeria, the issue around the herdsmen, because they are seen, from as I understand it, to be quite, or the president, there seem to be his people, and there's quite a lot of criticism. You have a vibrant media in Nigeria saying the president isn't doing enough. That's going to, all these issues get more politicised in an election year, and there are incentives for actors on both sides to be seen to be tough. So we see those as pretty intractable this year. It's not good for business, but let's be clear, Nigeria is a very resilient country, a resilient economy. I've spent the week in Lagos talking to businesses. A lot of people had a good 2017, business-wise, not all, but are positive about the year ahead, because they've kind of adjusted to the new normal, and Nigeria has an entrepreneurial spirit, I think, that often wins through.
I'm really questioning how far resilience will go, especially with this, the menace of the Fulani herdsmen, as well as those who argue that the herdsmen are really not the killers to begin with. There's so many stories coming up around that area. But my concern is how this is really going to affect investment in agriculture. Now, Benue State, where this is playing out, is, of course, majorly, call it the food basket of the nation to begin with. Then we have a situation where a bill has been passed or not about the issue of grazing to start with. The Fulanis actually provide most of the country the meat, the protein that it actually consumes. Let's talk about how this is likely going to affect agriculture, because at the moment, I do not think Benue, after a while, will still be attractive for investment in agriculture.
Yeah, it doesn't help at all, does it? It makes agricultural investment, it puts people off, and I think the lack of clarity, I'm saying the same thing, the lack of clarity around a resolution here, because part of this is driven by climate change. And the north is getting drier, the grazing is not so good. There are underlying long-term reasons, and then you're coming into conflict with people who've had a way of life for going back decades, centuries sometimes. So it's not good. And you mentioned earlier about Nigeria's attempts to diversify its economy. Agriculture, Nigeria has all the raw ingredients to be a hugely successful agricultural producer. Yeah, not good. It's, when we talk to companies outside of Nigeria who are looking at agricultural investments here, this thing has really blown up in the last few months in a way that was probably not expected, and it will stall that. It is stalling investment. I'm sorry, I can't be more positive.
Well, thank you so much for that. I've been speaking to Nick Allen, CEO, Europe and Africa region, Control Risks. As we continue our focus on top risks for Africa and the world in 2018. Still with me is Nick Allen. He's the CEO, Europe and Africa region, Control Risks. Well, thank you so much for staying with us on the show, Nick. And just before the break, we're talking about one of the risks here. I'm talking about terrorism and militancy. Now, irregular regulators, that's another point raised by Control Risks. Talk me through what this is really all about.
So we've seen, actually across the world, regulation being used by governments in a way either to pursue political agendas or sometimes quite legitimately to try and raise taxes. But when it's done in an irregular fashion, that's difficult for business. So when you talk to companies in West Africa, one of the challenges they face is they're not quite sure how the regulators are going to apply the regulations or whether they're going to change the regulations. And you saw this wasn't so much regulation, I guess, but the foreign exchange policies of the Nigerian government recently that it's eased a bit, causing real hardship for business, and there are obviously reasons behind the path they chose, but that lack of predictability, there's a cliche, isn't there, that business doesn't like uncertainty. Some businesses love uncertainty, but from a regulatory point of view, most businesses like to know, how's the tax regime going to play out, how is the banking regulations going to play out, and how are these rules going to be applied, and are they going to be applied to everybody in the same way? And we see, unfortunately, regulations being applied, sometimes with a political motive, and it's unhelpful because it makes harm.
Is there a major concern in the country for a country like Nigeria? I mean, we'll talk about, regulators and how it's going to go. Nigeria's made it very clear from the very beginning. We're really trying really hard to boost IGR to begin with. Isn't that enough signal really for investors that this country is all out to get money from every sector and everywhere?
Yeah, so signals are one thing. The actual implementation is another. And yes, I think Nigeria has been clear on the path it's on. It wants to make itself a lot easier to do business. It wants to improve its regulations, capacity building. There's a lot of that going on. I guess that takes time, and the signals are positive, business looks at that, and then they say, well, actually, how is this being applied? And that's where the challenge is, turning good intentions into reality. It's not an easy job. It's easy for me to sit on the sidelines and criticise it. I appreciate it's not an easy job.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about political instability. I mean, we actually touched on that earlier on the show. There are those who say, yes, elections are not near, but then they're close, for most Nigerians. In a country like Nigeria, there are those who also say, of course, election year or election calendar or activities towards elections will begin in the second quarter of 2018. Away from Nigeria, we're expecting a handful of elections in West Africa to begin with. Does that make it any easier, being that, we're not expecting so much to begin with? Do you think, in terms of political risks, it's a bit low this time compared to the previous elections?
Yes, so there's a certain predictability, isn't there, that if there aren't elections, that you sort of know what you're dealing with, and there's a certain predictability. Is President Biya going to be re-elected in Cameroon, assuming he's still alive at the time? He will be. But there is actually, if you look across, in a way, some of the risks stem more from ageing leaders in West Africa. Obiang in Equatorial Guinea, I've mentioned Biya. You have Debbie in Chad, who's been there for a very long time. Ouattara in Ivory Coast.
You don't foresee a change in those areas, do you?
Unless somebody dies, which is, there's some old men there.
They kind of live really long, don't they?
Yeah, they do seem to. And then you have, two countries along from Nigeria. In Togo, you have a challenge to what has been a dynastic rule with the Nassing Bey family really in charge for 50-odd years. Protests on the streets in Togo. Signs of change, but you're right, the lack of elections and the lack of contested elections. I mean, Nigeria is gearing up for what will be a contested election. Cameroon is pretty much a done deal in terms of how that's going to go. Not to say there aren't political risks in Cameroon. The Anglophone parts of the country are unhappy. But yeah, there's a certain predictability. But what's interesting, I think, if you look outside of West Africa, we've seen changes in sort of not party rule, but the leadership. Zimbabwe being the most high profile. That was a ZANU-PF issue, but the party's still in power. But then, people take Angola, Sub-Sahara's third largest economy. Dos Santos stands down. People think, that's the MPLA just sort of business as usual. And actually what's happening in Angola is some really interesting change there with President Lourenço. Isabella dos Santos coming off the head of Sonangol, brother coming off the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Things are shifting. So, even if the party remains, leadership change can sometimes actually really start to shake things up in a way that people don't expect.
So I guess when we talk about political instability in West Africa, we can actually smile a bit this time?
I guess in terms of predictability around what party is going to be in charge, but an election year in Nigeria is going to, a lot of the government is going to be focused on that probably more than long-term policy, because it doesn't know if it's going to be in charge. Although I think we'll see some movement on infrastructure. It's important just in the run-up to an election to be seen to be doing things successfully. The political risks, I think, in West Africa stem not from elections so much as that in a number of countries, the interference in business that politics presents.
That's true. So that's a really key point there. I mean, you never know what's going to change. I mean, we have this issue of the sanctity of contracts in a country like Nigeria. Contracts are signed as a new man at the helm of affairs. You never know what's going to really play out. Are we going to continue that contract, or are we actually going to end it? Let's talk a bit about new sectors, new risk. I think we find that really interesting. The fact that there are countries in West Africa that might look to develop underdeveloped sectors or even explore new sectors to begin with? Why do you think it's going to be a major concern?
Whether it's, I guess it's new sectors, new risks. Companies need to look at things differently. It's not necessarily a concern. I think if we go with a positive story, I think what's happening in Senegal. Senegal, pretty developed economy, but has spent it is freed to a certain extent from having too much oil wealth. There's a curse and a blessing to oil wealth, and really looking to develop itself as a financial services hub for West Africa. And we see private equity firms basing themselves in Senegal and looking to invest across West Africa. Ghana, after a few hiccups with sort of pre-spending its oil wealth, returning, I think, in terms of policy terms, to what Ghana has done well, which is actually try and diversify the economy, provide regulatory stability so companies can base themselves there. And it's competitive, isn't it? These countries are looking to attract inward investment. They want to be the hub for West Africa business. And Ghana, for Anglophone West Africa, has done quite well by making itself a relatively easy place to do business. It's a small economy compared to Nigeria, but it's won a few of those competitions, as it were, to establish itself as a place to do business.
Okay, now while investors wait on the sidelines to see how these new sectors evolve, what do you think governments and those in charge of these sectors should consider, while opening up that business space, especially when it comes to dealing with foreign investment?
So. We've talked already about sort of regulatory stability,
yes,
policies that make it easy for companies to invest, and let's be clear, companies invest because they want to make profit, so make it easy to make profit and take that back to a home country. If you talk about Nigeria, and we've been talking about this for a long time, infrastructure. I see your expression, but infrastructure, power. For Nigeria to again, as it did once, attract factories, attract manufacturing, which is good for employment, for formal employment, that remains a really key challenge. Lagos is a wonderful, vibrant place, but it's not easy to move around. There are power issues still, so sorry to produce an old issue, but it really is a challenge. And other countries in West Africa, I think, are making greater progress. And there are some new kids on the block also. Liberia just had a democratic transition. Very small country, sure, but it's we'll see what happens with President Weah. But a country that after a pretty miserable recent history of war, now trying to attract investment, and let's see how they get on.
All right, then. So basically, they should actually tread cautiously with regulations when it comes to opening up these new sectors to begin with. I was actually hoping for one word to come through there, and that's transparency.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. I mentioned earlier how important governance is, and transparency is key. And there has been progress in recent years in Nigeria around that, the one government account, things like that. Absolutely critical, because not only for the benefit of the citizens of whichever country we're talking about, but as you'll be well aware, there is a lot of extraterritorial enforcement, whether it's FCPA from the United States or the Bribery Act in the UK. And we started with Trump. Donald Trump hasn't changed any of those policies towards anti-bribery enforcement. The US regulators still going after that. Transparency, absolutely key. And if you look at economies in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that have done well, small one, but let's take Botswana, quite a lot of that is based on good governance, transparency. They don't always get it right, but yeah. Critical.
Now, very last point there from control risk, we're talking about ongoing operational risk. I mean, that's almost like a culmination of everything we've actually talked about on the show today. I might be wrong, but just tell us more on what point you're trying to make with that.
So ongoing operational risks are the things that make it difficult for companies to operate. And they, as you say, it's a broad spectrum of things, from infrastructure risks, but security risks are big sort of operational challenges that companies have because they cost money to deal with. So, making countries easier to do business, sort of going up the rankings in terms of ease of doing business, it's not just about regulation. It's about actually mobility of people. It's about attracting talent. It's about education policy. Some of these things are quite long term. It's a bit of a catch-all for for the risks that companies face in just the sort of day-to-day doing business.
All right then. Well, I guess we'll just keep our fingers crossed and see what 2018 has in store. But then I guess enough said already on the perceived risks in 2018: terrorism and militancy, irregular regulations, political instability, new sectors, new risks, and of course the usual ongoing operational risks. Thank you so much for your time. Pleasure. I've been speaking to Nick Allen, CEO, Europe and Africa Region Control Risks.